Hello, welcome back to Scherable. I'm your host, Bill Scher, and this is our first special edition of Scherable, our first with a special guest. We're joined by Liz Mair, and I don't have a handy dandy bio of you to resuscitate, but what I want to hear from you is your own little story, where you have been politically, who you've worked for, the trajectory you've gone on since, and where you are now, just to kick things off.
Okay, so I am a Republican political consultant. I consider myself to be a libertarian Republican. Probably the emphasis on libertarian over the last few years has heightened and the emphasis on Republican has decreased a little bit. But in past political work that I've done has included being the RNC's first and I think only online communications director in 2008. I also consulted for Carly Fiorina, Scott Walker in the context of his recall election, and then also his 2014 reelect, Senator Rand Paul on some stuff while he was in office. I've also done some work for Rick Perry in the context of his 2012 run. And what I was most recently known for in 2016 is I'm kind of considered to be one of the two founders of the Never Trump movement, although I'm the one that's probably veered in a slightly more, I would say, Trump skeptical as opposed to Trump oppositional direction since then. 2016, I also did some work helping Roy Blunt in Missouri. So that's kind of where I've been politically. How I describe myself now, I still say that I'm a Republican because for as much as many people are leaving the party over Donald Trump, my attitude is I was here before him and I'm not leaving. He can leave first. So that's how that is. But, you know, in terms of how I may vote this year, I live in Connecticut, so my vote counts for absolutely nothing. The state is going to go to Biden by like, I don't even know how many points, but probably at least 10. So I haven't made a firm decision about how I'm voting. And I guess this sort of transitions nicely into what we're supposed to be talking about today, because I am a Republican who is very clear in saying that if Democrats nominated Joe Biden, they had the prospect of getting my vote. I would feel comfortable voting for Joe Biden. And I think that's largely true, although there are a couple of things he could do to really seal that up at this point. At the same time, I am somebody who never wants to regret any vote that I cast. And so that does leave me wondering if I might still do a write-in of some sort. But
you want to do George Jorgensen?
I've considered that. I'm not 100% sold quite on what I've heard there. And so I guess, again, if I were in a place where I weren't going to vote for Biden, I would probably want to vote for somebody that I felt really 100% confident and in sync with. So probably that would mean a write-in, not a libertarian vote this time. In 2016, I did vote for Gary Johnson, and I did work to turn votes out for Gary Johnson, particularly in safer states. But Gary Johnson is a lot more philosophically in line with where I am. You know, he used to be a Republican governor, so he is really a libertarian Republican.
do you still work for Republicans, and are you still in regular contact with Republicans?
I'm still in regular contact with Republicans. We haven't done a lot of political work this cycle. About the only work that we did was focused on actually a primary in California where they have a jungle primary, but really we were treating it as if it was a primary between Daryl Issa and Carl DeMaio. And we were on the Carl DeMaio side of that, which was kind of interesting because with Carl DeMaio, you had this fusion coalition of people backing him that included extremely Trumpy people who didn't like Issa because Issa was very never Trump in 2016, very pro Marco Rubio. Also a lot of very hardcore libertarian people who were not very supportive of Trump. And then a bunch of independents who weren't Trumpy and just didn't want somebody who looked like a generic Republican. And I think some of them were attracted to DeMaio because he is a gay Republican and he's very open about that. And also is a very prominent voice on a lot of taxpayer issues in California, you know, which in that district are often front and center. So anyway, we did some work on that, but that was fairly short-lived. It was minimal. And at the end of the day, Daryl Issa is one of the two guys who's on the ballot next month, and Carl DeMaio is not. So that's what happened there. Yeah.
Well, I'm talking to you because you reached out to me. You had some thoughts you wanted to bounce off me regarding the prospects for healthcare reform and bipartisanship generally. And I'm very interested in the bipartisan question. I've been jousting with folks on the left on Twitter for a while now because I keep the door open to the possibility that bipartisanship is still possible and possibly even desirable. And most folks tell me that's insane, that's naive. We've been through this with Obama. We know how Mitch McConnell is like. Why would you, set yourself up to have, Lucy pull away the football all over again? And I think in general, not just you and me, but just we as a people, there's so little talk across the aisle. I mean, people know I talk to Matt Lewis all the time on our DMZ show, and I love Matt Lewis, but he's not in the halls of the Senate. He can't really tell me, what elected Republican officials are going to do, and maybe you're not quite in that position either. But I did want to get your sense: how ludicrous is it, assuming Biden wins, that he wins by a considerable margin? Is this potentially different than 2008? Could the Republican Party recognize they're on a bad path and make some kind of adjustment and work with Biden? Or is this going to be 2009 Redux? The way to stop Biden is the way to stop Obama: dig in our heels, give no ground, and wait for the gridlock to occur, and then wait for Democrats perhaps to do nuclear option or what have you.
Right. Yeah. So I do think that there are some differences. One of the key differences, having worked on the 2008 campaign, actually, I'll point to two key differences. One, as we all know, Obama hadn't really been in the Senate for very long. And so when he was elected, I don't think he had that deep institutional understanding of how individual senators think, how the body functions, how the House functions, because he didn't have to deal with them that much. And a lot of the time when he was in office, he was already on the campaign trail, right? So he probably lacked even more institutional knowledge than what most people would have thought. Now, Joe Biden obviously doesn't have that. One of the knocks that we heard on Biden coming out of the VP debate this week was that he has this lengthy, 47 years in politics. But the fact that he was in the Senate for so long means that he has a lot of personal relationships. He knows how the institution functions. He knows how to talk to people and how to move people off of things. And I think when you go and you actually look at Biden's record when he was Obama's VP, every time Obama got in a really difficult situation, that's when he sent Biden in. And actually, Biden was pretty successful in getting stuff done, a lot of it on a bipartisan basis. So I think that's one thing to point to. The second thing I would point to that I think is relevant to this question of will things just be like they were under Obama? One thing that people didn't really understand is that Barack Obama and John McCain actually had a fairly contentious relationship. And a lot of this came down to the fact that McCain approached Obama relatively early on, I think after Obama had been sworn in, about doing some work on, earmarks and waste, fraud, and abuse and spending type things like that. And Obama just didn't show a lot of interest in it. And I think McCain was personally very offended by that, right? There were things that I think McCain thought, hey, this is a new fresh-faced guy. He's going to have a different approach on to a lot of other Democrats. Maybe I can work on them with him the way that I did with Russ Feingold. And Obama just kind of rebuffed that. And so I think that was a particular problem once you entered Obama's presidency, because not that McCain was continuing to still steer the Republican Party, but I think that the Republican Party did feel that they got a little more punched in the nose in that election than what a lot of people realized. And part of the reason they didn't realize it was because Republicans who worked on that campaign, like me, were hardly going to go out and talk about, feeling really bloodied up by the result because, yeah, on the one hand, obviously, we all would have preferred for John McCain to be president. But at the same time, like, who in good conscience could really be sad about the country having elected its first African-American president, right? Like, that's a major milestone for America. And I think it proved a lot about who we were versus who we thought we were. And, I remember sitting in a meeting the day after Election Day at the RNC, where literally everybody at the table was like, well, that sucked. It sucked taking that defeat, but this is kind of awesome for America in terms of what it signals. It's just that what he's going to do policy-wise is going to suck, right? So I think that things are a little different when you look at Obama versus Biden in those two ways. And I think if you go and you look at Biden's record, jumping back to the point about his record of success with regard to bipartisanship, we don't have a lot of Republicans left in the Senate, and we may have even fewer after November, who look like Susan Collins, Arlen Specter, Olympia Snowe. But Biden did go and he did get Republican votes for the stimulus. He did do that. And that was very hard. You couldn't get Republican votes for it in the House, right? But he did manage to do that in the Senate. And one of the other things that, of course, I think progressives tend to gloss over because it's not one of their favorite aspects of Biden's record, is when you looked at when we got into a lot of these government shutdown, budgetary type debates, Biden's actually the guy who basically got everybody to agree to some belt tightening that enabled us to then reopen the government, right? So I'm looking at this as somebody who has always prioritized budget and spending issues, and somebody who anticipates that, as hypocritical as it may look post-November, the Republican Party probably, assuming Trump doesn't win, if Biden's in office, is going to get back to talking about fiscal discipline and fiscal conservatism. I actually think Biden is about the only guy who has a record of working with Republicans to achieve that and assuaging some of their fears and their worries and enabling them to bank a win as much as Democrats are banking a win. So I'm pretty bullish on the prospects of getting back to at least where things were under the Obama administration, which isn't where progressives want them, but it's a hell of a lot better for progressives than what we have right now, right?
Well, it seems to me that, I mean, one, I agree with a good deal of what you said. I've argued in the past that Obama had a better bipartisan record that people give credit for.
That's true.
Biden playing a big role in that. There's the 2010 tax cut deal. There's the 2012 fiscal cliff deal, which I think I don't think Obama wins re-election without the 2010 tax cut deal, which progressives hated, and Bernie tried to quasi filibuster. But that was your last shot of stimulus going into 2012, and the economy in 2012 wasn't all that good. So
no, that's right.
if it was worse than without that stimulus, who knows if he wins re-election, they didn't even get to the fiscal cliff deal. But Biden's personal relationships, there's been some churn in the Senate. So, he knows Chuck Grassley, he might know Richard Shelby, but maybe he doesn't know Ben Sass so well. Maybe he doesn't know Rick Scott so well. So does he have enough personal relationships to overcome the fact that the bona fide moderates like Susan Collins will probably be gone? You got Murkowski, sort of Mitt Romney, and then after that, it's pretty traditional Republican at that point. And the first order of business, most likely, is like in 2009, some kind of recovery act, some kind of big economic stimulus relief bill, not belt tightening. Can Biden get the 5 to 10 Republicans for that, saying, hey guys, this is the country. We're falling off the cliff here. We got to show we can come together. People are in need. And man, if you don't do this, I got a whole bunch of guys right behind me that are ready to nuke this place. Can he do that? Or are the relationships aren't there because it's a different Senate that he doesn't know the people as much, and they are a more fiscally conservative crowd, or at least will be now that Trump is gone?
I think, some of the relationships are different. There obviously are people who are new, although I'd say, you mentioned Rick Scott. Rick Scott is new to the Senate, but he was a governor at the time that Biden was vice president, right? And Florida being a big state, clearly they had to deal with him. So I wouldn't say he's necessarily in the same category as a Ben Sass or Josh Hawley, for example. But I think there is. There are still going to be moderates that people aren't thinking about. Nobody ever talks about Shelley Moore Capito, for example. But she's kind of like the uber moderate. She's the moderate from like the Trumpiest state in the nation. So we don't think about West Virginia because it's not a swing state. But, she is a pro-choice Republican woman that comes from a state that generally doesn't tend to, I think the electorate doesn't tend to feel that they benefit from a lot of vote or belt tightening. They actually do like spending money, right? So that's more classic moderate Republican. I think you have other people who are more moderate, who are in the Senate, who may be willing to work across the aisle, either because it's in their electoral instincts and their electoral best instinct or best interest rather, or because they do have those relationships. I think Mitt Romney has obviously shown some interest in working across the aisle on several things. I think when you're talking about putting an appropriate spending package together that's a stimulus, if it's covering off rural areas, you might be able to have a conversation with Roy Blunt. I would think similar to what you look at with demographics in West Virginia. Ohio is not the same as West Virginia, but a chunk of it is. So somebody like Rob Portman maybe is somebody who you could work with. And then, yeah, I mean, you know, you can go through others where I think particular regional differences and home state interests can be picked off too. And, you know, some of these people obviously did come from the House or from other positions where they will have had interactions with the Obama-Biden administration. So I don't think it's like they're coming to every relationship cold. And I think that will help him. But yeah, you know, I think where the fault lines are probably going to exist with regard to stimulus, you obviously do have this rift that McConnell keeps highlighting about how you're handling, you know, state and local taxes in blue states, and this idea of blue state bailouts and tying a certain amount of undoing of tax reform on that front into any sort of a stimulus package. I think that's tricky. But again, I think I would say, you know, Biden's expertise and history of working through certain tax things, I would give him better odds of solving that than, you know, if we were picking anybody else who had been running for president on the Democratic side.
Does it matter how many states flip and how many Senate seats go blue? Does it matter to Rob Portman if Ohio goes blue? Does it matter to Richard Burr if North Carolina goes blue? Does it matter to Chuck Grassley if Iowa goes blue?
Well, it may not matter to Chuck Grassley because I feel like Chuck Grassley is so old and entrenched in the Senate that he just kind of does business the way he does. But then again, you know, that goes to my point about Biden already knowing like what's going to move Chuck Grassley and what's not, right? But yes, I think if Ohio goes blue or North Carolina goes blue, that does affect the way that people think about that. Potentially that's true with Florida too. I would imagine Rick Scott to be less movable on that than Marco Rubio would, but who knows? It all depends on how this is looking. And at the moment, it looks like it's going to be probably pretty bleak in terms of the economic situation. So, you know, that might put some pressure points in different areas. But yeah, I do think that the actual results in the Senate obviously matter, and the results in the presidential matter in terms of, you know, you're still going to have guys sitting around or women sitting around who are going to be in states that Biden will carry, but they are Republicans. So, you know, I think Ohio is probably foremost among those. Pennsylvania, too, potentially. We know now Pat Toomey isn't running for re-election. I don't know what that does to how Pat Toomey votes on things, but it could potentially mean that if he's inclined to sort of soften up on some of the spending policy, he's now got an opening to do that because he doesn't have to run for re-election. He doesn't have to deal with the prospect of a primary, right?
Although I thought it was the opposite with Toomey, that if he was running again and Pennsylvania goes blue, he'd want to lean moderate. Now he doesn't. Now he isn't. Now he doesn't care.
There's that possibility. But one of the things I've always thought was interesting about Toomey was, you know, when he took over at Club for Growth, speaking as somebody who did consulting originally when I entered politics for moderate Republicans who really had a problem with the Club for Growth, one of the things I thought was curious about that was actually, if you looked at Club for Growth's own ratings of Toomey, they weren't that good, right? So I don't know what that means for Pat Toomey, but the point is that there may be some pathway there because, you know, I don't think Pat Toomey votes like Tom Cotton, right? But then again, with Tom Cotton, I mean, I don't know, you know, Arkansas is probably a little more government dependent than some other places too. So maybe there's even some pathway. Hard to say. I'm guessing, but.
What's better for bipartisanship? For Democrats in the Senate to win South Carolina, which would be a pretty big gut punch to Republicans to lose that deep in the South, and suggest that they need to make some big changes to get back on their feet. Or for Lindsey Graham to survive, and Lindsey Graham being a completely intellectually inconsistent person who likes being in the room, to say, hey, Joe, let's let bygones be bygones. I can be your liaison to the other side all over again.
Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, you know, it all depends on what your specific objective is with stimulus. And obviously, my specific objective is going to look different to most progressives, right? I mean, my instinct is that probably for Joe Biden, it's better if Lindsey Graham's out of there. I think Lindsey Graham could be so massively weakened by this fight anyway, that whatever clout he might bring as sort of a swing vote on things, I don't know if that's still going to exist. I also will just say, while this has really nothing to do with the topic of bipartisanship, one of the things that I think is so interesting about that race is if Lindsey Graham loses, we're going to have, I think, the first state in the country that's going to be represented by 2 African-American senators. And it's going to be from the state that was the first to secede from the Union and start the Civil War over slavery. How
right?
crazy is that?
That is
Right?
crazy. And
Um,
I was a huge Harrison skeptic. I mean, if I may
oh yeah.
be a bit of a braggart, I got a lot of things right this year in my analysis over the past 12 months. And the one thing that I'm potentially very wrong about is I was saying in the summer, stop wasting your money on Jamie Harrison. That is bottom of the list of pickup opportunities. And what I seem to have missed was there's been a huge demographic change. South Carolina is the 5th highest state in terms of out-of-state migration into
Mm-hmm.
the state. And so then you got a lot of new voters in there that have no bond to Lindsey Graham and
Well,
aren't that impressed with his flip-flop on judges. I thought maybe flip-flop on judges would be good for Lindsey Graham, but now it seems like
now
it's not.
I think Lindsey Graham has a number of specific problems, and obviously this wasn't what we were mainly going to talk about here. But if we just dive into it for a second, I mean, the Jim DeMint crowd in South Carolina never liked Lindsey Graham, right? I mean, he was always a big rhino. They were always looking for an excuse to get rid of him, and so I think you still do have people like that who are like, yeah, I'll take a Democrat for 6 years and then I'll get somebody better in. That's fine. So you do have some people there who I don't think are going to step up and help Lindsey Graham because they don't really care. I think you do have some people, you know, there aren't enough people in South Carolina who are pro Mark Sanford to have given Mark Sanford a real prospect of running for president, primarying Trump and carrying his own state. But there are just enough of them that I know who are just really aggrieved about the state of the party and are really pissed off about how Lindsey Graham has gone along with Trump, that those people also are not lifting a finger. So you have some interesting Republican constituencies that are not coming to Lindsey Graham's aid. I think also the fact that John McCain isn't around, you know, he was capable of mobilizing a lot of veterans in South Carolina to help Lindsey Graham. Lindsey doesn't have that, right? So I think you've got some real problems on the more Republican side of the aisle. And then, as you say, yeah, you've got a lot of migration into the state. You actually have a pretty significant immigrant population within the state. And I just think Lindsey Graham, he's not the most like charismatic and appealing and drawing of candidates, right? And so all of this is just combining in what I think is a really bad way for him at the moment. And he may survive, but he also kind of looks like that race kind of looks like the race where Mark Kirk ended up picking off a victory in 2010, right? Like really shouldn't have been possible. It's Illinois. But you can look at the polling now and see how it's feasible. We just don't know if that's actually going to happen, right? So, but I think Lindsey Graham is definitely an interesting character. And if he's not around, I think it will affect a lot of politics surrounding a lot of these things quite a bit.
Let me talk about issue by issue prospects for bipartisanship. Again, I think economic relief is probably first thing out of the box.
Right.
But you have a good amount of pent up demand on the Democratic side for a handful of big issues. I would think, I'm not putting these in order just yet, but climate, immigration, healthcare, voting rights. I feel those are the things I'm seeing the most of. Maybe gun controls in there too.
Maybe.
But
yeah,
I mean, that might be number 5 and all that. But of those, do you have one that you think, I see the path on that one, and others you think, that's not where I would bet my chips on right now?
Well, so I'm going to start with healthcare, kind of. And here's what I mean by that. Right now, we have Joe Biden campaigning on the idea of instituting a public option, right? In practice, I think that is a total non-starter. At the same time, I think that buttressing the ACA actually has a very good chance politically. And let me explain to you, this is going to take a little bit and it's a little bit convoluted, but let me explain to you why. So first of all, I think the general Democratic consensus, and I don't know that you and I necessarily agree with this, but I think the general Democratic consensus within the party and on the Hill is that Amy Coney Barrett is going to be on the Supreme Court. And when she's on the Supreme Court, she's going to say Obamacare is unconstitutional, and John Roberts can say that the individual mandate is a tax or whatever else he wants to come up with, and it's not going to matter at all because the ACA is going to be gone, right? I'm not sure that that's necessarily an accurate assessment, but I think it kind of doesn't matter because perception is reality here. I think what that means you're going to see is right now, Democrats are being pretty cagey about doing anything that looks like buttressing or fixing the ACA, because kind of if they do that, it looks like, oh, we're conceding there's a problem. But I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on Democrats to do buttressing and fixing of the ACA. At the same time, you have some very real problems with the public option going on. So the state that I was born and mostly raised in, Washington State, is seeing real problems with its public option. Its public option plans going into 2021 are costing more than the normal traditional ACA plans were in 2020. I think people are going to look at things like that and say, how is this manageable? Because truly, when you get into that sort of discussion, if you want to bring costs down, kind of the only way you're doing it is something that looks a lot like Medicare for all. That gets politically really tricky because nobody wants to be associated with the tax hikes apart from Bernie Sanders, right? He will push the issue because he's probably going to be Senate Help Committee chairman if, assuming Democrats win the Senate. Nobody wants to be associated with that. But also, as we saw during the primary, you have this really fractious intra-Democratic Party fight over anything that drifts towards Medicare for all, which I think the public option very easily could just because of this cost issue. Where, the Culinary Union in Nevada was very we're very skeptical about Medicare for all. This could really eliminate an important bargaining chip and something we use to attract people to us and ensure that we are representing this group of workers. But also I look at comments from somebody like Jimmy Hoffa with the Teamsters. I mean, the Teamsters were really late to endorse in 2016. The union base is pretty conservative. They're probably not going to want anything done, even if Jimmy Hoffa is going to say, oh, I like the public option publicly. I just don't think that they're going to want anything done that pushes towards Medicare for all, because clearly Hoffa sees that as a very important bargaining chip on behalf of his membership. And I think if you look at this Jimmy Hoffa or you look at the original Jimmy Hoffa, clearly they believe that's their union. It's theirs. It's their property. And so when you think about the psychology of that, that's just going to get really tough for a lot of union Democrats to support, instead of focusing on buttressing the ACA, which is judicially under siege and litigation-wise under siege. It's going to get tough for them to justify focusing on the public option, given cost, given taxes, given the union stuff. And then at the same time, think about what the Senate is actually going to look like at that point. If Dems retake the Senate, you're going to have senators like Sinema, Bennett, Manchin, Warner, Hickenlooper, Mark Kelly, maybe Bullock, maybe Cunningham, although I don't know, with his grilling and sexting scandals, anything could happen. You could have Democrats from Georgia. If you believe some of this latest polling out of Kansas, you could have a Democrat from Kansas. I just find it very hard to believe that those types of Democrats, if given a choice between let's fix the ACA and buttress it because it has all these popular components like things to do with pre-existing conditions and helping of rural health care, when a lot of these people could be representing states that have significant rural populations they need to deliver for. If it's that, or let's pursue the public option, I mean, clearly it's going to be fix the ACA, right? And then this is where I get to the point about bipartisanship prospects. Clearly, Republicans have always run on dismantling the ACA. But if you look at specifically what they say they're going to dismantle, there are like all of these things that are really core to the ACA that they don't want to get rid of, right? Like the staying on your parents' insurance until you're 26, the pre-existing conditions, all this stuff. And I could easily see, I mean, first of all, the ACA is Romney care, just national. So it's hard for me to believe that Mitt Romney, if asked, doesn't do something to help fix it. I mean, it's his baby, whether he likes it or not. So I think you've got that. But also, again, Shelley Moore Capito, you're really going to tell me that somebody who represents West Virginia is going to like allow the thing to be scuppered with no, like, what's the replacement, right? I mean, if the replacement is the public option, again, she's not going to go for that, right? So I think it's more likely she would fix it. Portman could be, I think, a factor there. If Susan Collins is still around, I would assume Susan Collins would be a very easy vote to fix the ACA and to buttress that. And then, you know, I also do wonder with regard to certain aspects of it, whether there would be a way to do that and pick off some people from some of these more stereotypical, you know, rural white working class states. Because at the end of the day, they do have populations that are really dependent. So I actually think weirdly, you know, the ACA was like this massive partisan dividing line, obviously, during the Obama presidency. And now I'm kind of wondering whether things have moved significantly enough that, I mean, you've seen Trump do executive orders that are basically him just saying the ACA is now Trump care, which makes it fine. If it's Obamacare, it's terrible. But as long as it's Trump care, it's fine. And I do wonder whether we're going to see a continued trend in that direction with just a few Republicans kind of playing ball. So that's what I would say there. Voting rights, I don't have a great sense on.
Well, let's stay in healthcare for a little bit before we jump on to the other issues. Because I've been I'm a huge single payer skeptic on the politics of it.
Yeah.
And in concert, I'm a huge public option skeptic, because at this point, public option is seen by the insurance industry as the same thing. And my basic worldview is, if you have unified corporate opposition, you can't get very far, because they will just flood you. It's not that they buy and sell politicians in the campaign, is that they flood you in the legislative process. They hammer you with propaganda. They poison the well in your districts at home. They make the politicians skittish that they're going to come at them if they go the wrong way. Whereas if you can divide and conquer, if you can get pharma to neutralize Chamber of Commerce money, as what happened in 2009 and 10,
right,
then you got an option to get the opportunity to breathe and get your message out. So I mean, there was a time when public option was more the alternative to single payer. I mean, there's a way you could structure it that the private insurers aren't being undercut, and maybe they would live with it. But if they look at it as, look, this is just a Trojan horse to kneecap us and get the single payer, we're not in. And that was a signal they gave to Obama in 2009. If you do this, we're out.
Right. Well, I think that's true, but I also think you have some factual arguments and some things going on in states that actually really undercut the argument for the public option, not even from it's a slippery slope, it's a slope towards single payer. And people who have a vested interest in this will never allow it. Like, again, going back to Washington State, where we're seeing public option plans costing more in 2021 than what traditional ACA plans cost in 2020. We've also seen, like, the insurance commissioner just came out with an announcement that traditional ACA plans, the cost of them is coming down by 3.2%. So, I think if you look, that's only one state, but I think if you look at that gap, like, why is the public option even appealing there anymore? What's it doing? Who wants it? I can see why people would still want Medicare for all, because if you're one of these people who genuinely believes if we throw everybody into the same system, you can achieve cost savings, whether that's Medicare or whether that was, if you go back and you look at Paul Ryan's idea about, like, I don't want to say voucher, but, obviously giving people some form of money that they would use towards purchasing insurance. Like, I think that there is theoretically an argument for that, but I just don't understand when you're looking at the Washington example right now, at least when I've been looking at it and when I've been talking to people back home about that, where's the appeal of the public option? There may be an appeal for Medicare for all. But yeah, that's so tricky. And I think you're right in terms of a lot of the business interests there. But I really don't think the business interests aren't going to be the thing that stops Democrats from doing that. I think it's going to be your culinary unions and your Teamsters. I really think that's what it's going to be, because there is this split within labor. Some people feel that, if you pass Medicare for all, then you get rid of this whole healthcare as a bargaining chip, and you have unions that can go in and can just get people higher salaries. But there are obviously a lot of very powerful union leaders that think that's a totally bogus argument. So until you get unions all siding with the people who are pro single payer on that, I don't know how you get Democrats to a place where they're even really seriously willing to consider it. Also, I would add, Bernie Sanders being in charge of health. I mean, when he went on Jimmy Kimmel, I guess it was last week. I mean, he's talking a lot about prescription drugs, and that's a way more consensus issue right now than any of the rest of this, right? So.
Well, so if it is the case that the politics points Democrats towards bolstering ACA, which I generally agree is the case, I mean, in theory, I'm not as convinced Barrett is sure to strike down ACA. I mean, obviously it could happen. I think it's possible either on constitutional grounds. The case before them is a little bit different. It's about standing and severability. Right. It's not necessarily about the tax penalty question as it was before. So maybe she wouldn't do it on those grounds. And there's the politics question. Are they going to say, hey, we gotta slow our roll here, or else we're going to, induce a court packing push if we get too radical right out of the gate. So I still don't know what she's going to do. I don't know what she's going to do. But if you wanted to protect yourself, if you're Joe Biden and the Democrats, if you had the votes, you'd say, hey, let's just make a $10 individual mandate, boom. that constitutional question is off the table. The whole case is moot. But Correct. You would need some Republicans to agree to get the 60 votes to get that passed before June and make that case irrelevant. Right. I mean, that's just one way one could bolster the ACA. Do you think Republicans would be willing to do something in short order to short circuit what might happen on the court by June?
Well, I think it's not just a question of Republicans. If we're talking about how this plays in the Senate, there's always the question of, can the Senate really do anything in short order? I mean, we joking aside, they are a pretty deliberative body. That's a question. But I think, yeah, to me, when I'm looking at the ACA and what's in question in this case, it is a pretty simple edit. Like with my recovering lawyer hat on, I'm not going, oh my God, we have to do like a whole rehaul and replace of 2,700 pages. Like it's a pretty small thing that has to be done. So I think that reduces the complication. I think that, well, let's say you don't even call it a $10 tax, call it a 50-cent tax. Right. Which I think then I believe that would mean if you did that from an IRS standpoint, you would round that down to zero, right? I mean, so you can do whatever, but yeah, do I think that Mitt Romney would support that? It's hard for me to believe that he wouldn't. Do I think that Shelley Moore Capito would support that? It's hard for me to believe that in practice, when push comes to shove, if it's that or your population that's full of, a lot of retired and disabled coal miners who obviously have pretty serious pre-existing conditions. You have a coal sector that's in decline anyway. So there's just a lot of economic pressure there. I think also, with COVID, obviously you have more people unemployed. That means that still being in an employer-driven system, we have more people that don't have insurance. More people having to go out and figure out how to acquire that. It just gets really hard in some of these states, I think, for people to not say, okay, call it a $1 tax, whatever, I'm done, we're good. I don't think it's going to be the overwhelming majority of Republicans. I think which Republicans and how many depends on the specific results in Senate races. As I say, if Susan Collins stays up, well, then I'm pretty sure you got one Republican vote for it right there. It's bipartisan. But yeah, I do think that there is a pathway towards doing that. And I think that that's more straightforward probably than a number of other issues that we could be looking at in the next Congress.
So when I look at those other issues, climate, immigration, voting rights, guns,
right.
I mean, in my mind, I can see the bipartisan path on
right.
climate and immigration more than I can see it on the others. In fact, voting rights, I mean, the bigger the Democratic win, I think the less interest is going to be in voting rights because it's not going to seem so pressing. If you're winning South Carolina, I'm not sure.
You don't have a problem, right? Yeah.
Whereas climate, there are business interests who have a climate plan, who show openness to carbon tax. I mean, they're going to want something in return.
Sure.
They might want legal immunity. They might want other tax cuts. They might want deregulation, but there's the olive branch is offered. And immigration, you already had Republican support in 2013. It was the House that screwed. Now the House isn't going to be the Democratic problem. So if you can still get that Senate support, you're done. So those I can kind of see. Guns is a cultural fault line. That's always trickier. I'm just curious does that resonate with you that those things are actually possible?
Yeah, but probably in a slightly different way. So what I would say, talking about climate change, is I had a very interesting conversation with a guy, I guess it was probably about 2 weeks ago now, who is really trying to push a lot more with regard to carbon capture as a climate change solution. And obviously that's not as comprehensive as what a lot of progressives are talking about. But one of the things that I think is really nice and interesting about it and presents bipartisan appeal is people from oil and gas states, so Texas, they want it because they can use that to make wells more efficient and get more out, which, more product to sell. Who doesn't like that, right? The cement industry, they're producing a bunch of this stuff. If you capture it, they can sell it. Steel, we're having a hard time figuring out with steel. I mean, you've got a whole bunch of states in this country where everybody who's running for office in them is constantly talking about how to help the steel industry. We don't seem to have figured that out. I mean, we've tried a trade war, that hasn't worked. We tried the stuff that Bush did when he was in. That just got us in trouble with regard to trade organizations. You can try direct subsidies, but then you get into questions about whether you're subsidizing something that's a dirty industry, all of these kinds of things. But with steel, you are producing a lot of carbon that can be captured and then can potentially be put in a pipeline and shipped to oil and gas guys so that they can use it in their production process. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why that could be appealing. Is it going to cost money? It's going to cost some money. But realistically, I think anything we do on climate is going to cost some money. And the question is, how do you ensure that, you don't have this sort of traditional division of who's getting screwed and who's getting the benefit? And so I think carbon capture might look really interesting in that respect. So I'll be interested to see if they push on that. On carbon tax, yeah, I do think that there are more Republicans that are getting on board with that. I just think the problem you always run into with carbon tax, as with most use taxes, is if you're saying that something is bad and you're going to put a tax on it to try to disincentivize it, well, you better not be relying on that money too much, because if you're right and people actually do what you want, you're going to end up with a bigger budget problem. And so that, I don't know, with Biden as president, if that's what happens, I mean, he is somebody who is a little bit more of a debt and deficit hawk. So I don't know how the politics of that totally gel. But I do think the carbon capture thing is really interesting. And they obviously did get some bipartisan support for carbon capture legislation that has been moved recently. So there's like a template there to copy. And then with regard to immigration, I will try to limit my comments on immigration because I work on it. I care about it. I'm married to an immigrant. My family didn't come here that far ago, at least generationally. So I have a lot of empathy with today's immigrants, including my husband. But I will say, yeah, you did have a bunch of Republican senators vote for this not that long ago. So there's that. But also, I think the whole framework of the discussion on immigration has changed, right? We're now in a place where you've got a lot of base Republican support for codifying DACA and not just leaving that up to the courts. I mean, I think John Roberts got his ruling right when he looked at the APA and all of that. But I think in general, people feel that having that be an executive decision is not smart. And there is base support for codifying DACA. Is that enough? No, I don't personally think it's anything close to enough. But I also remember in 2006 and 2007, when we were talking about something that would be the equivalent of DACA codification. I mean, that was so controversial. You had tons of Democrats saying you couldn't support that, right? So I think the whole discussion has really shifted on that. I think one thing that is a little tricky is with the rise of sort of the DSA folks in the Democratic Party. They don't tend to be super favorable to a lot of high-skilled immigration and H-1Bs. Maybe there's some stuff on the legal immigration side that needs to be reformed and overhauled that could actually be made trickier in that respect. But I think DACA, I mean, it really shouldn't be that hard of a fix. The biggest challenge with DACA, I think, is because it's so obvious and common sense to so many people, it's easy to turn it into a Christmas tree and then have people be like, I hate that ornament, I'm not buying the thing. Even if I love everything else, I love all the other decor, I love the color scheme, but that one ornament, no way. So I think that would be my concern there. But yeah, I mean, there are obviously tons of other immigration issues that we could parcel out. I don't know if you necessarily do things in a comprehensive fashion or if you do this piece by piece, but I do think that it should be feasible to make progress on immigration. Yeah.
So I know you have to run and I have to run, and we should wrap things up, but just as a way to close out, because you mentioned there is this growing populist socialist faction in the Democratic Party. Biden is saying explicitly that he's a bulwark against it,
right.
and you have Republicans saying.
I think that the DSA folks actually, in many cases, they'll hold their nose and vote for Biden, but I think they might actually hate Biden in some cases.
I'm sure they do. I mean, I think they're going to be loaded for bear day after election. They want to push him as hard as they can. And you have certain Republicans saying Biden's, a shell of a man. He's going to get steamrolled. They're going to do 25th Amendment and shove him out and put Kamala in there, and then she'll be a secret socialist. To what extent do you think some Senate Republicans can make the calculation, it's better for me to show early that I will work with Biden to take the wind out of the sails of the left wing of the party? Or am I so nervous about the left wing of the party that I don't want to go near them? And then as a result, you end up giving them more power because they can say, you can't work with these guys, so you might as well nuke the Senate. You might as well pack the court. There's no openings for you here.
Right. I mean, I think that's going to depend a lot on individual Republicans. I suspect that people who I perceive as not necessarily the more pragmatic people, to use a common term, or the more moderate people. But the people who I would say are more long-term thinkers in the party, those are the people who I think are going to say, let's work on some stuff and shut the DSA guys out and down and prove that there's no market for this and there's no need for this, right? I would think that kind of argument would be persuasive to somebody like a Portman. It might even be persuasive to somebody like a Roy Blunt if you're structuring it correctly. I mean, I still think it's really interesting when we're talking about bipartisanship. You go and you look at that vote on, sort of slapping Trump for the wall funding situation. A lot of people were like, oh my God, why is Roy Blunt on this list? And I was like, well, I mean, look, I don't know Roy Blunt super well, but here's what I know about Roy Blunt. Roy Blunt is very, very cautious about maintaining his own authority and his own power, which obviously when you are a member of Congress, that means appropriating and being in control of the money. So if you mess with that, you're going to run into problems with somebody like him. And there are some people who do still think like that. I mean, I think Grassley maybe is another one, right? So I think that's your question, is the people who do see an important role for Congress, want to be protective of that, and want to think long-term about things. Those are the ones that I think are going to be more inclined to kind of find ways to work across the aisle. The other area, though, I will point out is, Biden isn't known as being like a great civil libertarian, but I think one positive effect of some of the DSA folks is that they have pushed him a little bit on that. And you could actually see some good bipartisanship on civil liberty topics if Biden wanted to move in that direction, because you do have a glut of Republican senators who are very noisy, like to filibuster, like to go on TV, are better interviews than, I don't know, Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton, for example, like get a lot more traction on Tucker Carlson, a lot more people tune in who really care about those kinds of issues. So I think it kind of depends on what people want to prioritize and how they talk about it a little bit. But I do think, going back to our basic sort of premise starting this, when people are saying, oh, you're never going to be able to work with Mitch McConnell, get over it. I mean, I don't think history bears that out. And I think that there are some reasons why. It all depends on the specific results on election day. But if Biden is elected, and if he's elected with any significant mandate, and you see a Democratic Senate, I think there are some areas where, yeah, you can achieve bipartisanship. It's not going to be that Biden's going to say, let's pick like the next Sonia Sotomayor in terms of being the most left-wing person we could put on the court. And Mitch McConnell's going to go, cool, totally down with that. Like, that's not going to happen. But there are some other areas that actually are pretty important to average Americans.
Now, I've been generally thinking of this as, how can Biden work around McConnell and pick off enough people to get to 60? Do you think he can go as far as actually working with McConnell directly, whether McConnell is a majority leader or a minority leader?
Maybe. I think a lot of that depends on what McConnell's race actually looks like and how strong he comes out of it. What's he left with? The specific composition of the Senate Republican caucus is going to have a lot to do with this. But yeah, I mean, I think there's always some prospect for it. There are certain things, McConnell's, I think the difficulty with McConnell is the one thing that Mitch McConnell really cares about is staffing. He's like the only guy in the world that I think, honest to God, was born and somebody said at 5 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? And instead of going, I want to be a paleontologist or a marine biologist, or I want to be a TV star, he went, I want to be a human resources manager. That's what he's like, the world's greatest human resources manager. And so in some respects, when you think about it that way, that's going to be tough because he does see staffing as totally his purview. But there are going to be things that are going to matter for Kentucky, where I think you can find ways of reaching across the aisle. So I don't know. But I trust Biden more to do that than I would any other Democrat, because he has the history of doing it. He knows McConnell very well. If anybody's going to be capable of doing it, he's going to be the one to do it.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. If folks want to see more of your work, where should they go to check you out? Oh,
I'm on Twitter way more than I should be because social media is addictive. So you can just go to @LizMair, LizMair. Or, I am on TV occasionally. So tune in and watch my Twitter feed and I'll let you know if that's the case. Otherwise, if you want to hear more from us, you can go to my corporate website, which is mairstrategies.com. We have a contact form there. I try to reply to virtually everybody unless somebody's sending me, spam messages in Chinese about Viagra. So yeah, try to be pretty responsive.
Excellent. Well, this has been Scherable. If you like this and want more, please click subscribe. If you want to support the show financially, you can go to patreon.com/BillScher, and we'll be back with another episode of Scherable pretty soon. Thanks, Liz, and thank you all.
Thank you.